gathered virtually today for obvious reasons. It would have been superb to have seen you all face to face, to have admired the latest additions to the Chiefs Trophy cabinet. Sadly, that's not to be. We'll just have to make sure they win them both next year so that we can look at them admiringly. I think today we've got three key issues that we want to run through. We've done the welcome and housekeeping. Next, we're going to meet the panel. Then obviously the reason that we are all here, and then maybe a couple of closing comments if we've got time. But I think really the meat of it is the panel discussions. Okay, so this is the panel today. Lord Matthew Taylor of Gosmore, little introduction, I think. Perhaps he holds the one-time record for being the youngest MP at the age of 24. Since then, he's had a glittering career in policy making and administration. I think most notably for many of us, leading the Garden Garden City initiative, and also for the consolidation of all of the planning guidance that now forms part of the PPGs that we all know and love. So Nick Bryant, Assistant Director, Somerset West and Taunton Council. Nick's bio speaks for itself. He does also tell me that he was cheated off the weakest link about 13 years ago. And I'm told it still haunts him. Richard Harrison, Land and Planning Director of Taylor Wimpey. Well, there it speaks for himself. And Richard has been a little bit backwards in coming forwards about an interesting fact about him. So I'm going to hand over to see if he's got anything interesting to say now.
Nothing like putting me on the spot. My interesting fact will be that I once upon a time hitchhiked from the Hopwood Park services on the M42 to Africa, completely free of charge. Wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but say one way of travelling. Say if you're up for it.
Brilliant, superb. Thank you, Richard. We have David Richardson, partner and head of planning at Ashfords. This is cracking. David tells me that he delivered his second child single-handedly because the ambulance arrived late. Talk about learning on the job. Well done, David. Good to have you on the panel today. Thanks, Jojo. And last but not least, our very own Robin Upton. You know that Robin's an extreme marathon runner. His last race was non-stop, 24-hour race across the rain-lashed counties of Devon and Somerset. So a pretty awesome experience, which I think he won't forget in a hurry. So thanks, Robin. Welcome to the panel. Okay, so here's the broad structure for today. We're going to leave it as relaxed and as open as possible. We're going to kick off with the planning white paper. We want to talk about the government's sustainable agenda. There's a lot of stuff in this that I think people probably have yet to hear a great deal about, so it's definitely worth touching on that. And then finally, I think the one that a lot of people who've spoken to me this week want to hear most about, and that's phosphates. So without further ado, I am going to introduce the first topic, which is the planning white paper. Now, on the panel today, we've got some really good, insightful characters who are going to be able to tell us a lot about how it's seen from every perspective that you can imagine. And the first perspective I think we want to touch on, Matthew, I'd like to bring you in on this one if we can, but what we're trying to get to here, Matthew, is what are the hot debating topics in Westminster on the white paper? And have you got any views on what you like, what you don't like about it, and also what you think will stay, go, be modified, and so on? So if we could bring you in there, Matthew, that'd be brilliant.
Well, let's take this in two halves. So I'll come on to a bit about what I think, but it's unsurprising what the politics of this are. Firstly, it gets wrapped into the whole numbers game. So there's been huge tension on the numbers, and particularly where the numbers fall. And the fall in of the numbers towards the areas of high housing need, as articulated not just by the demographics but by affordability, of course, means that much of that's in exactly the areas where more rural districts have been successful in many cases in fending off development over many years. And that has led to considerable controversy around it, and you only have to look at the national papers to see that. With a, well, why aren't you building more in the north? Why aren't you building more in the cities? Why are you despoiling the countryside? Personally, I have a short answer to it, which is, well, that's where the housing need primarily is, and it's where we've primarily been under-delivering, and the government aren't wrong to highlight that. But you may have seen newspaper headlines suggesting that the government is reversing course, that there'll be more for the urban areas, less pressure on the green belt and some of those rural areas. I've been pointing out to colleagues who are involved in planning that should be no surprise, because actually the government signalled all along that the initial figures they presented didn't take account of the constraints and that they would need to be balanced. So in effect, I think one might argue they put up a bit of a stalking force to attract the gunshots, and then had something to offer back in return for that. But it will remain controversial, and there are a lot of members of Parliament who feel that their constituents don't want to see development and are pressing back. I hope they don't, because I think those houses are needed. Secondly, there's been, for probably a rather different group of MPs from perhaps a different part of the political spectrum, enormous concern about the getting rid of Section 106 affordable, and how a simple contribution system, will that actually deliver the affordable homes that are needed and in the form that is needed? There, I have to say, I have more concern. I'm a big advocate on simplifying SIL. SIL, a lot of the problems of SIL came from the housing industry itself, which lobbied for a more complex system and then almost immediately regretted it when they got what they lobbied for. And what we're really returning to, if you go back and look at the origins of this, is pretty much exactly what the then government originally proposed. And I suspect we will see that simplification. But there is precious little answer, really, about how you will deliver the right kind of affordable housing in the right places out of this. And I suspect that's the part of the white paper that is, well, in my view, most in need of modification, but actually where we may see the biggest changes, assuming they don't just back down on the whole thing. And I think they probably won't. I hope they won't, but we will see. And then there's this broader debate about quality and what the growth areas mean. And there, I think it depends a little bit which bit of the architects of this that you're talking about. You've always had people from Policy Exchange, very influential now in Downing Street, who've always argued for this tiering. But for me, and I advise both local authorities, but also a lot of promoters of new settlements, sustainable urban extensions, or large-scale urban regeneration schemes. Actually, of course, what we all suffer from is the complication of the long-windedness of getting it through planning. And in particular, the fact that really we need the local plan process to deliver that big vision. And yet we struggle to get that in. And then you've seen examiners not putting it through in places like North Essex, because they said, well, how are you going to deliver the infrastructure? And actually, the white paper is very much about delivering for people promoting large-scale schemes and local authorities wanting to bring forward large-scale schemes, a simpler way of doing it. And frankly, an answer to the problem that we have with planning inspectorate at examination around these unanswerable questions of how you deliver infrastructure. And for me, actually moving these big scale strategic decisions to the local plan is right. I think that would be enormously helpful. And I think too little attention has been paid to what's being said alongside that, which is that the local plan would, if you like, set the quality thresholds, the fundamental process of that it will have to be mixed use, that it will have to be well designed, but not going too far down the route of fine detail for projects that may be delivered over 10, 15 years. So I think there's a direct attempt to address some of the issues we've seen with large scale schemes. I bear many, many scars. We still haven't built a single house at what was originally St Austell Eco Town, now Carl Clay's Garden Village. We hope to start in New Year, but that's I was first involved in working on that 2007-8. I'm still chairing the strategic partnership, and we've delivered employment, we delivered a road, but we haven't actually delivered a single home, and that I think tells you why there are some reforms needed. So the debate is around that, but not all of it, I think, well judged. Will the white paper roll forward? I think it has to, because otherwise we're simply not going to deliver the homes we need. Will it be tweaked? I think it's bound to be, but I think they've set up some things to step back from, and we're already starting to see this on the numbers.
Yeah. Sorry, Matthew. I think that resonates really closely with the feeling that we have as planners. And at this point, I'd like to bring Nick Bryant in, if I may, Nick, and just for you to pick up perhaps on a couple of those points relating to the local plan process, the delivery of homes and affordable homes, and really to talk about perhaps if there's anything relevant you want to mention about skills and resourcing at local planning authority level, but also I think the nuts and bolts of what the planning white paper is seeking to achieve, and how you as a senior local government officer are seeing the challenge. Thanks, okay. Nick.
Yeah, no problem at all. So, I mean, I think the first thing for me to say is that I think as a planning professional, I think it's really important and quite valuable to see the government reinforcing the importance of a plan-led system, as Lord Taylor's just said, because obviously we've talked about having a plan-led system for a very long time, but it doesn't sometimes feel much like that. Yeah. And actually, taking the white paper at face value, that does appear to be a genuine commitment being made. I think there's arguments about the price that's being paid in order to make that transition, but I think that's really valuable. I think around plan making as well, it's I suppose the two sort of key bits that I guess I've picked up on is, in terms of, on the one hand, saying that we want to simplify the process for preparing a local plan, which is to be welcomed, but almost then the tension that's set against around front loading some of the work, whether that be around engagement, whether that be about the evidence base to inform those plans and policies, and particularly the strategic allocations that are made, and just how that tension might need to sort of play out, because certainly in my experience, and I'm sure it's the experience of many people on this call, you know, the development planning examination process is often incredibly long drawn out, and we shouldn't sort of underestimate, I suppose, irrespective of the sort of streamlining that the government has got in mind, the fact that invariably there will need to be changes made through an examination process, and those changes will need to be subject to consultation and so forth before any development plan can be sort of signed off. I think it's helpful that some of the things that we've been asked as officers to do, certainly for probably the last 10 years, in terms of repeating national policy, we're being told we no longer have to do. I think some of the policies that we have in core strategies in particular, or strategic local plan policies, often add very little, because effectively the only reason we're allowed to have them is if they're in total conformity with the NPPF or national policy, and often that they scarcely put any sort of local on the application of those policies in a particular locality. And I think the other thing that is really positive is the added emphasis around design and quality of place, and some of these sort of sentiments have been expressed by government over a period of years, but we're now starting to see a little bit more evidence that's being backed up in policy, and actually starting to sort of reflect through in that way. In terms of the challenges or some of the sort of questions that this poses for us as a local planning authority, or for colleagues and peers, I guess it's really around capacity to deliver, and it's about the sort of skill sets, well, both capacity but also the skill set to deliver against that, because the implication of front loading some of this work is that we will need to do an awful lot more of the detailed work up front. And local authorities in general, but specifically planning departments, haven't necessarily fared terribly well over the period of uncertainty, so to speak. And I think just finally, if I may, just on the point of actually two more points. One, One point on housing delivery overall, I think I would say that yes, as proposed, if the white paper and the standard method as proposed were to be brought into effect, that would present some considerable headaches for many councils, particularly in the southwest, because we would be going back to the sort of level of housing that was proposed within the Southwest Regional Spatial Strategy, and I would be concerned for my area in particular that those figures were likely to be sustainable over any period of time, and our ability to deliver, quite apart from our ability to identify the sites to meet those requirements. And then the last point I will make, just on the affordable housing point, is very much to echo Lord Taylor's comments about that's really an area that I do feel incredibly uneasy about, because put very simply, I would worry about how far commuted sums will go to delivering the affordable housing that we desperately need and in the right areas. But those are just a few thoughts for me for now.
Perfect, thanks, Nick. Well, we can, if it helps, we submitted a whole load of call for sites to you, so there's plenty of opportunities in there. Just you know, have a look at some of them. What I'd like to do, I'd like to bring in Richard and Robin, because Lord Taylor and Nick have mentioned here about the role of the development industry. And about this quite significant challenge that planning authorities are going to face in preparing a local plan in 30 months, what with all of the other things that they're being asked to do. And it's really just to try and understand what the industry's thinking, Richard, about that, and about what role you think you can play. Is it more of a collaborative role with planning authorities? How about things like viability and determining detailed layouts and drawings and access points and all of the kind of evidence base that you might submit as a part of an outline planning application? Will you be able to bring that forward to the allocation stage in a local plan preparation?
Thanks, Robin. I think the white paper thrust is clearly towards a front-loaded system. So you'll start with the process effectively of, once your plan is made, your permission is available, and that's your outline consent in principle. For developers, what that's going to mean is an awful lot of very early, potentially abortive costs to ensure that the site is deliverable, and you get all your technical information in place. Now, what that actually will mean is all of that work will just have to start sooner. So you'll be in a position of effectively having additional time, additional cost right at the very earliest stages to ensure that your schemes do come forward as planned, frankly. Now, that does have a little bit of issues in terms of risk for developers, because obviously that's time and effort and work and cost potentially before they're even submitting an outline application. And there's also a little bit of tension there between putting all of that information and all of that work at that time, but also with the aim of trying to streamline and speed up the plan making process. If effectively what you're asking your plan to do is to provide an outline consent for your entire housing requirement at that point, that's an awful lot of work to be done for a local authority by all of your applicants and developers in a 30-month timescale. So whether or not that's deliverable or not, I think devil remains to be seen, really. It's devil's in the detail there. But yeah, the general thrust of having a front-loaded system, I think, something that most developers would support. But say it does mean that all of the cost and time will have to be spent at a very early stage. It's not something that you can dip into at a later point.
Okay, Richard, thanks for that. Matthew, you had your hand up there. Do you want to come in?
I just think I want to differentiate here, because I think where the local plan is asking for this is on the large scale schemes. I wish they hadn't called them growth areas. I think it's much better to talk about them as big strategic schemes, whether they're SUEs, garden communities, which of course I work on a lot, or in some cases major urban redevelopment projects. And I think I'm probably partly urban, because I think it may not even count for the growth strategy in most cases, but certainly for the other two it does. And in that context, I work on many of these around the country, and in order to promote them, they have to go through the local plan because they're at a scale that has to go through the local plan. And the people who are putting them forward have typically got big teams working on the design. They will have a master plan. They will be talking about the range and mix of services. And to me, actually, what happens is you go through that process, then it's challenged by the examiner on viability, and the whole thing starts to get unwound on, frankly, unrealistic questions about how you're going to deliver infrastructure in 20 years' time with government grants that the government's not even decided on yet in any event. But also, then, of course, through land sales, transfers, all the rest of it, actually what's delivered very often, there's huge pressure to do something rather different from was originally promoted. And the aim of this really is not to ask people to do the work twice, or even to do an enormous amount more early on. It's to take that proposition that is typically presented early on and put it in policy terms, where if you promise 3 schools and a shopping centre and this parkland, that's what you're going to deliver. And to me, that is actually a really important process of certainty, because in every scheme I work on at the moment, people simply do not believe that what they're being offered up at that early promotion stage is what they're actually going to get. And let's be blunt, I have sat in a number of meetings where QCs have said, we'll offer this, but of course you don't actually have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a big point, and it's something I'd like to perhaps bring David in on now, because talked a little bit about delivering infrastructure. Our experience when we go and talk to communities is, well, where are the schools? Where are the doctors? Where's all the social and community infrastructure that's coming alongside your big strategic scheme? They're the things that concern many communities, traffic and other things as well. But David, we're talking about big changes to the way that type of infrastructure is going to be delivered. We've got thinking, well, the white paper is talking about a nationally set value-based flat rate charge, payable on completion. It's supposed to be simple, flexible, because it can adjust to the market. But the problem is getting the balance right. Too low and it doesn't deliver the infrastructure, too high and it chokes development. And it's actually payable on completion, so the development is complete, but where's the infrastructure? So local authorities are going to have to, like Nick's, are going to have to borrow against something that might or might not happen in the future. And then, of course, there's the issue with, well, if you sweep away 106, well, how are you going to deal with things that aren't financial contributions like public open space and so on? And I think what I'd like to hear from you, David, is how you think that is going to, that whole infrastructure delivery point is going to work in practice when, on the one hand, you've got the house builders who are keen to get on and deliver housing, but on the other, you've got a community that is saying, well, what about us? Where's our infrastructure?
I think that with SIL as well, there's been a big disconnect between what's paid and what's delivered, and that was always one of the issues that viability brings to the table, which is if what you're collecting is only a small part of the cost of the infrastructure, then as an authority, collecting authority, you can't really give firm commitments to deliver anything, because you won't have the full cost. You'll have a certain amount through SIL, some through 106, but you can't commit yourself. And so there's that issue of deliverability that might remain with the new infrastructure levy, because as you say, it can't be set so high that no one can afford it. And we don't know if there are going to be exemptions to the new infrastructure levy that might come in, for example, for viability. So there's still that question mark over, will it deliver what it needs to in terms of infrastructure? I'm not entirely sure how you fix that disconnect between local communities and development. I think some developers have tried to publicise more what they've brought to the table in terms of 106 contributions, whether signs on site or on their websites, but people don't really engage with that. And it's not necessarily that easy to find annual monitoring reports that tell you what an authority's been spending SIL on. And equally, and it's quite damaging to the system, there are rumours that obviously authorities are sitting on millions of pounds and just can't spend it. Whether true or not, I don't know. But you're right, I don't see anything in the white paper that directly addresses that gap between the collecting the money and actually delivering the infrastructure, which I suppose would be one of the concerns of it. Forward funding might, And that's one of the reasons Milton Keynes worked so well. It essentially had a banker involved there that forward funded that infrastructure. And then, so I suppose the issue there is, again, can you gather enough finance to forward fund the infrastructure you need? The costs will be significant on large urban extension sites.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's interesting. Robin, I'd like to bring you in here very quickly if I can. We'll probably wrap up on, I mean, we could go on probably all day on the white paper, but we've got other things to talk about. But Robin, I'd just like to get your thoughts really on this whole thing about the delivery of market and affordable homes and the infrastructure levy, and how you envisage it working in practice. We know the plan making process is under pressure. We know about the timescales that are going to be introduced. What does the development industry have to do in order to deliver homes and actually make that contribution to the community?
Sure. Well, it looks to me fairly obvious that essentially the paper is trying to get more of a contribution from the landowner or the land value towards the public purse. And in a way, it reminds me of the Shinfield viability decision, where the sort of public benefits were creeping up and up and up, and the land value was creeping down and down and down. And in that particular decision, it was felt that there should be an equal split between benefits to the public and benefits to the landowner. So it's sort of getting to that sort of point. I read in the paper that there would be a maximum threshold, but that's not defined how that would be calculated. And in terms of affordable housing delivery, somehow the paper thinks it's going to increase the amount of affordable housing on development sites. Effectively, it seems you will be able to get credits for delivering affordable housing on site to reduce the new national CIL liability. So I think that's the sort of mechanism for dealing with the affordable housing. Obviously, as David said, there needs to be a balance between providing for infrastructure, affordable housing, but the tariff needs to be low enough to incentivise landowners, and that's always been a key part of the viability conundrum. So it will be interesting to see how they go about measuring how high the CIL rate should be on a national level. Obviously, there's regional fluctuations. You've got brownfield sites and greenfield sites where viability would be very different. It'll be interesting to see how they're going to deal with that. Interestingly, there could be another rush to obtain planning approvals under the current CIL regime if it turns out that the current regime is cheaper than the national one. So that there might be a scratch to get permissions over the line as soon as possible. But I think in general, just summing up, I think anything that's simpler is obviously going to be beneficial. And dare I say it, the devil will be in the detail.
Can I just chip in there, Simon, just very quickly, just to address 106? I don't think it's actually intended 106 will be completely got rid of. I think it's alluded to in the footnotes of the white paper, and it's come across in some of the presentations that have been given on the white paper. So I think the intention is 106 will remain to deal with some of the knottier kind of very site-specific issues.
Okay, that's a really helpful clarification. Thanks, David. Okay, look, we could go, like I said, there's a whole load to digest about the white paper, a lot yet to be seen. The devil is in the detail, definitely. And it will be a long process. The government's chief planner said, we're looking at a couple of years. It's primary and secondary legislation, changes obviously to the MPPF and PPG. So there's a lot of water to flow under this particular bridge. So we just need to be mindful of what's happening and keep lobbying going. So look, I think we'll probably wrap up on the white paper there. What I'd like to do very quickly, because time is marching on, I'd just like to pick up very quickly a couple of comments on the government's sustainable transport agenda. Now, back at the beginning of the pandemic and lockdown, the Prime Minister made a series of comments relating to cycling, and these seem to have resulted in the publication of 2 documents. Local Transport Note 1/20, cycle infrastructure design, and also a gear change, a bold vision for cycling and walking, again published in July 20. And these documents, I think, are pretty significant, but have not received a great deal of airplay. And without further ado, Robin, I just wondered if we could just pull you in here very quickly, just to give a very, very scant overview of those documents. And I'd like then to turn to Matthew and to Nick, because Matthew and Nick have got particularly local and national insights into the policy formulation, and Nick particularly in how he's looking at them through the eyes of Taunton as a garden town. Thanks, Robin.
Okay, thank you. So the 2 documents that you referred to have been produced by the Department of Transport, so they are published documents now. Effectively, as I see it, they carry the same sort of weight as Manual for Streets, which we all know and use quite commonly on housing development sites. It's effectively becomes a similar document to that in practice. It provides a sort of manual for providing certain degrees of cycle and pedestrian facilities separated from traffic where roads are of a particular speed. In the main, they apply to existing streets, you know, how to incorporate cycle provision on existing streets, but obviously they will apply also to housing developments as well. I think where we could get caught up in the interim is where local authorities produce plans in accordance with these documents. There could well be a rush for Section 106 contributions towards these infrastructure plans before potentially those go into the national infrastructure levy. So I think a lot of it will depend on the local authority where you are, how advanced they are producing their plans. We know that some have already are in the process of doing so, and some of them haven't taken on board these documents at all. So I think really it's a case of watch the space, and probably through your transport consultants, ask them to see if there's any particular implications in the area. Are there any plans in place that the development is supposed to connect to, and those sorts of initiatives really, and keeping an eye out on what local authorities are doing in terms of funding these things. Are they trying to get development to pay for them, or are they trying to get the infrastructure levy or the national infrastructure levy to fund them? So that's my view on them in a nutshell.
Excellent, thank you. Jojo, you got your hand up there. Can I just bring you in?
Yeah, not really to contribute, but just to remind everyone, please, if you're not on the panel, could you please turn your camera off? There's a couple that have still got cameras on, so if we could just make sure those are turned off. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. Thank you. Matthew, can I bring you in here, please, just to sort of give us a national and a policy angle on this. Obviously, the Prime Minister has got a foreword in the gear change document, so it's something he's pretty keen on. Could you just give us a sort of a national Westminster angle, please?
I'm not sure whether it's a Westminster angle, but perhaps more a policy angle, but also, of course, I work mainly on larger scale schemes, and for larger scale schemes, I think the important thing is bearing in mind that we really are entering a different world, and it's a mix of not just climate issues, but health issues, and trying to create, and it's what I do all the time, is large scale but mixed use communities where most movement is internalized, that there's a big range of services. It's really, and it's a different mindset about what placemaking is all about. And it's a while now people have got very used to delivering a primary school as part of the development, but they need to be thinking about delivering community shops, cafes, the whole range of facilities that makes what I often describe as a 21st century market town or 21st century village, and that's as true of the old style, the neighbourhoods of London. Often London's described as a set of villages, and it's a very good way of understanding it. And it applies too to large urban renewal schemes. Now, that in a way is the easy bit, because you can see how that works. And all of the schemes I work on are, people are getting more and more expert in active travel. It's really interesting work. Delivery will be different. It's much more the realm of the master developer in terms that you might be more used to in Europe or even in America. Whole place creation, neighborhood creation, which we used to do really well, but gradually died away. If you then look at the smaller schemes, the question is, well, how do you apply that in? I mean, I'm working on a scheme on the edge of London that we're talking about the streets around it being changed to mini Holland style. You can fit those things in, but you have to. But we're talking quite radical change, and one of the things we're having to do there is engage very, very strongly with the community, because the community have doubts about their own streets being reformulated. Their reaction is, well, it's going to be traffic jams, or even just it's going to be roadworks. So taking people with you in those circumstances is difficult. And in other places, the question is, well, how is it deliverable in traditional street patterns? Although Mini Holland does start to give you some answers around that, I think. How that will all flow through and how councils will deal with it and how developers will deal with it, I think it's still an evolving place. But I think it's really, really important to understand this is the world we're moving into. This different way of moving, that the era of everyone can jump in their car is going, and it's going because as people have been able to afford more and more cars, we've just got more and more log jammed. And in particular, I think the era in which you could build a substantive estate on the edge of town with no facilities and say it was sustainable because it was quote unquote walkable into the centre, but actually nobody ever walked, and it had no facilities within it, and in reality it wasn't really in any normal person's walking distance, and the school anyway that you had to go to was the other side of town, and the workplace was somewhere else again, and so on. I think that era has changed. So although there's, I think, a lot of hands going up on how do we do this, actually the thinking process on how to do this, people need to get their heads around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to bring Nick in very quickly here, Nick, if we can. But Nick's authority is having those particular challenges you talk about, Matthew, about big urban extensions, how they connect in with the centre, how sustainable they truly are. And obviously, as a garden town, Nick, you're living and breathing all of those challenges.
Yeah, we are. I mean, I think very, very quickly. I mean, I would just sort of say that Taunton, in particular, there are opportunities in our town that perhaps don't exist necessarily to the same extent in other places of a similar size, insofar as Taunton is relatively flat, a good existing network of green and blue infrastructure in terms of a canvas to effectively develop and improve. We're really keen to understand the opportunities that brings, because of course the urban extensions, the new garden communities that we're talking about often do benefit from reasonably good access to existing networks. So I think that's the key one for us, to not just purely look at that from an online perspective in terms of works to the public highway, but also in respect of green and blue infrastructure. And I think that's quite important around, perspectives of safety and desirability, and particularly around some of the quality of life and health and well-being sort of benefits, because actually there are many people that won't want to kind of brave the A38, for example, at rush hour to sort of get into and out of work, sort of thing. So I think that's quite an important one. And I think the other quick point I will just make is that actually, even prior to these governmental announcements, there had been a commitment to the development of local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, through which Somerset was successful, and I know Devon as well. So those plans are really, really important. They've not yet fully and finally been signed off, which is a shame, but But those plans, which have been prepared for Taunton, Bridgewater and Yeovil in the case of Somerset, are really, really valuable because they will actually help us to identify, and they have, because I've seen the work in progress for Taunton, almost like some prioritised areas that we can work on. And actually that should give us something to actually go to government for when there are opportunities to bid for funding in terms of a sort of tangible scheme. And what I'm hoping, and what we're all hoping, is that we'll start to see the government funding to go with that, because in the past all the funding through local growth funds and whatever has been ploughed into sort of highway schemes. And actually that's all well and good, but all it's really doing is just moving the problem a little bit further along, or resolving. It doesn't actually address the fundamental issue. But I've tried to be quick on that, so hopefully that's a helpful comment.
Yeah, it's really insightful. Thank you, Matthew and Nick. I mean, what you talk about there, Nick, local cycling and walking infrastructure plans with the cracking acronym LCWIP, they are being, or you are being asked to develop them, as if you haven't got enough to do. Anyway, I think we're going to leave the transport side there. It's really important that everybody's aware of these initiatives, because they are going to start affecting certainly large scale developments, but pretty much all developments, I think, are going to need to have their eyes open to these sorts of initiatives. So without further delay, I'd like to move straight on to phosphates. Now, a lot of people have been on the phone to me this week and said, look, this is the hot topic of the moment. And what I'd like to do is just to bring in as a guest on the panel, as it were, one of my colleagues, Phil Druce. Phil's a WYG director. He's got over 20 years experience in the water industry, and that experience is pretty much focused around water quality. So I'm hoping, welcome Phil, good to see you. I'm hoping to just bring Phil in where we can in order to try and clear up, I think, what is a little bit of a mess. Now, I did try and get somebody from Natural England on the panel, but I think they're all under close police protection at the moment, so they're unable to join us. So, without further ado, David, I'd like to bring you in, please, to start. I think what it would be really helpful is just to, set some of the legal context behind the mess that we're in, the Natural England letter to the 4 authorities. I think actually trying to understand something about the classes of development that are affected: commercial, residential. Does it affect reserved matters and prior approvals? And there is a cracking question that Andrew Kitchener asked me a week ago, and that is, can councils just grant planning permission, but with a Grampian style condition relating to mitigation? Now, there's loads there, so I'm going to hand straight over to you. Thanks, David.
No, that's fine. I'll try and summarise the Habitats Regs 2017 in 30 seconds, if I can. But that's slightly difficult. But there's some key points to note along the way. And the first point to note, and it's part 6 of those regs that we're looking at, is that it's a duty on local authorities. So I know for the developers dialing in, it feels like your application and your permission, but the duties that we're going to talk about are on local authorities, which is why I suppose control of that process feels a little bit out of your hands. The other point to remind ourselves is that there's a screening stage in appropriate assessment. So appropriate assessment is just what you do to try and work out what the likely significant effects are going to be from a habitats perspective. And like EIA, there's a screening stage. You can't take into account mitigation at that stage to avoid having to do an appropriate assessment. i.e. you can't say there will be effects, but this mitigation will do X, Y, and Z, therefore we'll screen ourselves out. So it's just a reminder that you can't do that. So mitigation doesn't come in until you've been through screening. So what's the overall sort of legal control? Well, that is that if a project's likely to have a significant effect on an EU site, and I use that term colloquially to kind of cover Ramsar sites, SPAs, SACs, and all of that jazz, then it must make an appropriate assessment. And this is the key bit. That's before it gives any consent, permission, or other authorization. And that's pretty typical for European legislation, that kind of wide drafting, because there's a purpose behind this legislation, which is to protect the environment. And that becomes important later on to remember that purpose. So you can see just that phrase could capture all manner of things, not just relating to the grant of planning permission. It also requires consultation by local authority with Natural England, and then for the local authority to have regard to what Natural England says, which is, and I'll come on to Andrew's question later, why it's not necessarily that easy for a local authority just to metaphorically stick the V's and just grant consent with a Grampian condition. So once you've been through screening, and let's say you're screened in, we'll come on to what Natural England is saying about that in a minute, then you can consider mitigation. But the Dutch N case, which is the case that's cited in the Natural England letter, has something to say about that kind of process, which again I'll come on to just after I've set the context. And then it's important to note that a local authority could agree to grant permission even where it knows there are negative effects which can't be mitigated, but it can only do that if there's no other solutions and also if there's an overriding public interest. And so I suppose one of the interesting questions there is, would significant housing demand balance the scales so that the authorities should be granting permission anyway, irrespective of negative effects that can't be mitigated? And that might be one for discussion later. But if it does do that, if it does allow a scheme to go forward, knowing there are negative effects, then it does have to secure compensatory measures. So compensatory measures are different from mitigation. Mitigation stops the harm happening. Compensation is allowing the harm to happen, but you compensate some other way by closing down a farm somewhere or something like that. I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek when I say that, by the way. And again, compensatory measures can't form part of appropriate assessment. So that's after you've decided there is harm, then you can try and compensate for it. And you do also have to inform the Secretary of State when that happens and give them 21 days to respond. So that's the kind of general context. There is a part of the regs that deals specifically with planning permission. And this is chapter 2 of part 6. And it says that the assessment provisions I've just outlined do apply to the grant of planning permission. And then it goes on to say what planning permission is. And this is relevant to whether reserve matters may or may not be called, because it defines planning permission as permissions or decisions made under Part 3 of the 1990 Act. And I suppose the argument would go there that reserve matters aren't granted under Part 3 of the 1990 Act. They're granted under the Management Procedure Order. But again, perhaps we'll just come back to that very quickly. In terms of Grampian conditions, so where an authority knows there's going to be harmful effects, so it's done its appropriate assessment, the regulations do specifically say that the authority can require mitigation through conditions or limitations. So the point about Grampian conditions is an authority must know, in a sense, what it's getting into when it grants permission. It must know what the harm is before it decides whether it can mitigate it with a condition. So you would still need to go through the appropriate assessment process before you could even think about Grampian conditions. So that point there's no escaping appropriate assessment, I'm afraid, not in that context anyway. And then again, just to allude to outline and reserve matters, the regulations also talk about outline permissions. And they say that the LPA mustn't grant outline permission unless it's satisfied, whether due to conditions or limitations or otherwise, that no development is likely to adversely affect, no development likely to adversely affect can be carried out, whether before or after reserve matters. And I suppose my chink of light here is that if the regulations had wanted to say as well, an authority shouldn't grant reserve matters until it's gone through that process, it could have, but it doesn't. So that's the kind of UK legal context. Why has Dutch N made a difference? Well, there's 2 points really. The first is what can be taken into account in terms of mitigation. And the second is what bar are we trying to get over? How likely does the mitigation have to be effective, or how likely is it the mitigation will work? And the first point is that the European Court of Justice judges said that assessors should not take mitigation into account if the expected benefit of those measures are not certain at the time of assessment, which is a higher bar than we were currently used to. So it's requiring certainty as to mitigation, and that's causing eyebrows to be raised. And I suppose the most useful quote from the case is, and it's talking about Habitats Directive here, which is what we've implemented in UK law and the Habitats regs, but essentially they are one and the same for the purposes of this quote. And the quote is, the directive must be interpreted as not precluding national legislation which allows the competent authorities to authorise projects on the basis of appropriate assessment. That is so, however, only insofar as a thorough and in-depth examination of the scientific soundness of that assessment makes it possible to ensure that there is no reasonable scientific doubt as to the absence of adverse effects. So again, it's requiring a high degree of certainty. So as Natural England interpret that, they say that authorities and appropriate assessments must rule out any reasonable doubt as to the likelihood. And again, the other overarching point to take from Dutch N that Natural England are adopting is that where you already have a bad situation, and I'm paraphrasing here, then it's pretty likely that any addition, in this case of phosphates, is going to need appropriate assessment because you're already in a bad situation. Therefore, it's hard to see a kind of workaround from a developer's perspective when authorities are receiving that kind of information from Natural England. So in terms of what developments are affected, well, actually, it's not a closed class. What you see in the letters from authorities and Natural England are the types of development they think will add phosphates into the system. So that's residential because of wastewater, it's agricultural, anaerobic digestion, possibly commercial. I mean, Natural England seemed lukewarm about commercial. I think authorities have tended to adopt the view that where there's more floor space or more employees, then it probably could fall under this umbrella. But generally speaking, you don't want to double count. So if you are trying to count the impact of more people, say, you're better off counting houses than you are counting commercial floor space. Other things that are caught are prior notifications. That's clear from the regs. There's specific regulations to do with general development orders. So the use of permitted development rights that require prior notification are in. Reserve matters is not necessarily an easy one, and I don't want to put lots of QC's noses out of joint because no doubt they're making loads from advising everyone whether it's in or out. My personal view is that it feels like they're probably in. There's quite an interesting case, which is the Wingfield case in the High Court, and that was a situation where at outline stage, they simply just didn't do an appropriate assessment. They forgot. And then, so they came back at reserve matters stage and remedied that by doing appropriate assessment. And the judge in that case took a lot of learning from the EIA process, which Europe looks, so no other European planning system has that kind of two-stage consenting process, but it sees outline and reserve matters as two stages of the same thing. So it's a two-stage decision-making process. Where EIA has an express preference for assessing things at the principal design stage, you don't find that in the Habitats regs and the Habitats directive. The Habitats directive has an overall purpose of protecting the environment. So Wingfield found that it was lawful, not that you had to, but it was lawful, at least, to do appropriate assessment at reserve matters stage. And so I suspect local authorities will take that and say, well, we've got the ability to ask for appropriate assessment of reserve matters. It's not unlawful. And we've got this overarching objective under the regs. We've got to protect the environment. Therefore, actually, it would be remiss of us not to ask for appropriate assessment at reserve matters stage and probably be subject to challenge. So that is, I suspect, how a lot of this will come out. Again, just touching on gramping conditions, just to reiterate, yes, that's a way forward, but you've already heard how much certainty you have to have about how effective those mitigation measures are going to be. That's probably enough from me.
That's really super context. Thank you, David. I'd like to bring Nick in here because Nick's authority, along with Sedgemoor, South Somerset and Mendip, are in the thick of this. And I know that Nick has been very hands-on with those other authorities and probably received quite a few angry telephone calls from various applicants in the area as well. So Nick, could I bring you in, please, just to get your thoughts on where you as an authority are, where the four authorities are, and to maybe to chart how you think you'll unblock all of this.
Yeah, okay, that's absolutely fine. I mean, yes, it's true to say we are all absolutely as Somerset districts affected by this, as indeed is the County Council as Minerals and Waste Planning Authority. So we're all absolutely caught. I think it's fair to say that some of us are caught more than others, and to that end, it is Somerset West and Taunton with the greatest number of planning applications affected. So at the moment, by our estimates, we've got about 300 applications under review, which equates to more than 5,000 units, and about somewhere between about 1,200 affordable housing units within that are kind of under review. By comparison, and I haven't got the figures for all the other districts, but I think Sedgemoor's figure is more like 30 applications. So we are at the sort of extreme end of it, but I know Mendip are also in a very sort of tight spot with all of this. So yeah, as you say, we've been working together with our neighbours, and there's almost like two sort of elements to our response really. So one is recognising that there's clearly a longer term strategic planning and policy making issue that goes with this, in terms of, well, what's the long term strategy for addressing this, and what hooks do we need to put in place through policy, and that's one piece of work. But the more important and the more pressing piece of work that we as a district have committed to, and we're actually working quite closely with Mendip on, is on an interim commission that we've let in the last couple of weeks to Royal Haskoning, and essentially what we've asked Royal Haskoning to help us with is two tasks really. So task one is to try to get us to a point as quickly as possible where we can come up with a standard method or formula for quantifying and calculating phosphate loads from different types of developments based on different site typologies, with land in whatever current use that it might sort of sit. And those of you that might have done any sort of background reading will see that similar sorts of methodologies have been developed in other parts of the country that have faced similar challenges, like the Solent in Hampshire, but also Stodmarsh in Kent and various other places. So that's part one, and that's obviously going to be incredibly valuable to applicants because it will help to kind of establish a bit of a baseline about how do we actually assess, well, what difference will my scheme make in terms of this problem overall. And the second bit, which is every bit as important really, if not more so, is starting to give us a bit of a steer on some of the interim solutions and responses that we can kind of put forward to all of this, because as you imagine, there's any number of developers, applicants, other parties kind of coming to us. Well, what about this? What about this? Can we do this? Can we do that? And so forth. And we need to get to a point very, very quickly of understanding what the sort of almost like the toolbox of potential solutions might be. This commission that we've got running is a 4 to 6 week commission. It's a very, very sort of tight sort of commission. So there's quite a lot of work being condensed into quite a short order and period of time, and that's really with a view to try to sort of give a better sense as to the way forward as quickly as we possibly can, because what we're acutely aware of at the moment, it's not our fault, but we absolutely empathise and sympathise with the development industry on this. There's a problem that's been presented, but we have no sense at the moment as to what we might need to do to resolve that problem, which is obviously incredibly undesirable from everybody's perspective. So that's really where we're coming from. I think it's also worth just touching briefly on some of the sort of legal angles here, and David's right to say that there will be a lot of people making an awful lot of money out of giving legal advice to different councils and developers through this sort of position that we find ourselves in, and from the networks and connections that we've made with other local planning authorities, it's fair to say that there are outliers, there are authorities that have made conscious decisions to deviate from the position that other councils have taken, and that's interesting. And I think from my perspective and from my council's perspective, it's about us being in a position that we can make an informed judgment on these matters, which being blunt and candid about it, we're not necessarily at that point as of yet. So I think the one final thing that I will say is we are endeavouring at Somerset West and Taunton, and the other districts as well are doing this to a greater or lesser extent as well, to try to keep applicants as much as we possibly can in the loop. So we're trying to keep the Phosphates webpage that we've created up to date. There's a frequently asked questions document that will be on that website by if not the end of today, then certainly early morning. And I guess the critical thing is recognising that this is very much a kind of iterative thing. So one of the things we discussed this morning is that FAQ document can only be as accurate as the point at which it was written. So effectively, our advice, I'm afraid to say, we are going to need to kind of keep under review to a degree. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense. I've actually got one more quick point to make, and I think it's a really important one to stress, and that's we are really, really sensitive to the impact on small and medium-sized enterprises through all of this, because some of the larger sites, there may be, once we've worked our way through this, more that they might be able to do to offset their own impact or be able to kind of offer up their own solutions. But we are acutely aware of the fact that actually there will be any number of smaller schemes that won't have that to be able to fall back on or as an option, and therefore to that end we do need to build into the work that we're doing in our priorities what we can do to support them, and that might be about doing things like almost setting aside a budget once we've got an idea what the strategic solutions are to kind of accommodate some of those sort of smaller schemes which otherwise might be delayed for a very, very long time.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you, Nick. At this point, I obviously we're way past the hour mark, but the numbers seem to be holding up very nicely. I've not seen any comments from anybody to say they've got to go or we'd like to draw it to a close. So at this point, I'd just like to carry on if we can. We seem to be on a bit of a roll. Phil, can I bring you in at this stage, please? You've heard David, you've heard Nick talking about the legal and local authority context and the work that's we've just heard that's been commissioned by the 4 authorities. Could you just give us an insight, please, from a water industry position, how you kind of see the problem and how you would go about addressing it if you were maybe advising a developer or maybe a group of developers? Mute.
Yes, so what's the problem? A very simple level. We've got problems with our watercourses. We're seeing algae blooms in them. They're taking oxygen out of them. Ultimately, our rivers are below the water quality we'd like to see in them, and that we're not complying with what we're trying to achieve against the Water Framework Directive. And phosphates are really being pointed at as one of the key causes of that. It's not the only one. And there's not that many studies to say it's purely phosphates are the problem, but it is a core issue that we do have too much phosphate in the watercourses. So that's our problem. But I think possibly the question we should be asking, Simon, is why? I mean, why have we got that problem? And there's probably an easy answer there. We can go and look at the water utilities. We know they discharge a lot of water into the environment, and we know there's a lot of phosphate in that. So we could easily say, why aren't they doing more to clean it up? But I think if you go and look inside what's happening in the water sector, you'll say that would have been a fair point 10 years ago. But tens of millions of pounds have been invested with water utilities in actually removing phosphates from their discharges. So yes, they're still an issue, but they're a fraction of an issue that they were 10 years ago. And actually, as they put this treatment in, so to provide another level of treatment to get even more phosphates out, it's becoming more and more expensive. So the return that they're seeing for taking more phosphate out is actually quite poor, and the benefits to the environment are diminishing. So if we're saying the utilities are there and they're a part of it, where else should we be looking for the problem? And we've touched on it a bit earlier, agriculture. Farmers applying fertilisers to their fields. We'll get runoff from there straight into the watercourses. Cattle just grazing by the edge of the watercourses. Manure dropping phosphates into the watercourses. So we've got sources around agriculture. We know about it. Very hard to quantify. There's not that much data to really say that's exactly what's coming in from each of these various sources. And then if we go and look in towns and villages, again, ideally all the sewers are perfect. We get no discharges going into the watercourses, but there's plenty of work that's being done. We've spotted actually there's misconnections. People have dropped their washing machines into the surface water system. Every time they turn on their washing machine, phosphates discharged to the environment. So there's a lot of accidental, non-intentional discharges into the environment from other sources. And I think what I'm really trying to say here is, why have we got these phosphates in the watercourses? we know there's quite a few sources, but we don't really understand exactly how much all of them are contributing to the problem. So yeah, that's initial thoughts. Let me move on a little bit. So what do we do about it? I'm an engineer, so my natural tendency is let's focus on the problem. If we really understand the problem, we're probably actually going to start to understand how we tackle it. We've touched on this a bit. We can see that there's various sources of phosphates entering watercourses, but how much do we really understand them? We can go to the water utilities and see what they're discharging, and they're doing a good job complying and doing what they said they should be doing. But what about all these other sources? There's some data out there, the Environment Agency collect data, but there's not fantastic detailed data to understand where it's coming in each catchment in terms of who's putting what in. So if we want to reduce them, we've got to know how we're going to address that problem. And that's probably going to say we've got to invest some time taking sampling, measuring the loads in dry weather conditions, wet weather conditions, different times of the year, and actually understanding where is this phosphate coming from. If we can move to the position of saying we understand where it's coming from, we can then say how's the best way to actually solve it, reduce it, and actually create some headroom to allow us to do more developments. And looking at similar problems that have been faced elsewhere in the water sector, they're not always what you think they are. And actually some of these problems are very cheap and easy to fix once you've invested time to understand what they really are. So I think what I'm saying here is invest time in understanding the sources, do the sampling, get the data, the real facts to say this is what's causing us our problems. And if we've got a good grip of that, we can then put together a very clear roadmap and say, if we target these 3 or 4 sources first, that will drop the phosphate level by this much, it creates some headroom for ourselves. We can then actually put some more developments in. And actually by knowing the sources of problems, we can say these are cheap ones to fix. Yes, the water utilities might be a big problem, but the cost of actually going and getting them to take more out is astronomical. That's not the cheapest way of tackling the problem. So it really comes back to understand the problem, get the data backed up with science. And if you can then present a really strong case backed up by science, it's very clear how we go about tackling it. Now that's a bit of a long-term plan. We're not going to do that in 6 weeks. It'll probably take a year or so to actually go and do the work properly, really understand it. So shortcuts, in theory, yes. We've got to feel that if we target agriculture and reduce fertilizers, if we look at trying to stop cattle grazing by the sides of rivers, that should drop it a bit. And we can probably come up with some estimations of what that's going to be. And then if we look at the technologies that are out there for new developments, we could say, actually, if we're putting in a new development, we could put in very bespoke package plants that remove phosphates to a very high level, far in excess of what the water companies can do on the very large scales. So there's opportunities there that we could actually put in very high levels of treatment, but not exceptional cost, to compensate and then get the compensation through working with the farmers to actually drop their loads that they're dropping into the watercourses. So possibly a long-term thought process there, and then maybe a few quick fixes so that we don't have to wait too long before progressing things forward.
Philip, sorry, can I just butt in and just quickly ask, kind of on behalf of the developers, how easy is it to extract water, phosphates from water? And the on-site plants, Natural England don't seem that keen on them, to which my view would probably be, well, if the mitigation works, there comes a point where the regulator needs to back off a little bit. But how easy is it to deal with things on site?
It's a good question. If you look in the water treatment works, it's been done for about 10 years now. Typically, it's done by chemical dosing. To get to a reasonably good standard, it's pretty easy. It's chemical dosing at the front end of the treatment works, costs you £750,000. But what we're seeing now is that's not enough. And so it's having to put additional treatment processes in at the end of that, at the big water utilities. But the technology is evolving very quickly. It's been a relatively new requirement to remove phosphates. There's emerging approaches. We're working with 1 or 2 companies on this, looking at biological approaches, no chemicals involved at all, actually produce far high standards. So it's getting easier, it's getting cheaper all the time because the pressure on to reduce phosphates is there. And so it's driving innovation and driving new approaches. So I would say it's getting easier every day. In answer to your question, David, it's not exceptionally hard until you try and hit very tight standards. And even those tight standards are getting easier as people are developing new biological approaches to do it.
Thanks, Phil. That is really insightful. So I think the message I'm getting is that actually there is a long-term effort, but I think that's going to require the industry and authorities to be working perhaps a bit more closely together, dare I say it. But there are opportunities for individual developments, and I would have thought that we're looking at on the larger scale, Phil, here, are we, to cover the costs that you're kind of talking about. Clearly that won't deal with the SME builders that Nick was talking about. So I think that the challenge lies in is unlocking those interim solutions while having an eye on the bigger picture. We're not going to get, it's a fact, we're not going to get farmers across the levels to implement radical change at this point. But if I could bring in Matthew at this stage, because one of the things that the industry has been a little bit hot and cold on, in my opinion, is effective lobbying and representation to government. And I'm just keen, Matthew, if you can just give us a bit of an insight as to how high a profile Phosphates has in Westminster and the Lords in policy making terms, and how sensitive and supportive are ministers to actually Natural England's position, or the developers, or where are things sitting?
Well, if you took the specific example of the levels, of course the profile's pretty low. You're going to get individuals raising it because they've got the local interest, but that's as far as that will go. I think there's two things I really wanted to say about it. One is there's a risk of being seen to be Canute-like, trying to stop the tide coming in terms of environmental action, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think the idea somehow, look, we've always done this, we're going to get on with it, people are stopping us building houses, it's not really that big an issue, is it? That's not going to work. So if you get on the wrong side of this, I think you're just kind of pushing against history, pushing against the tide. I think what the industry really needs to do, in fact, and the industry in this context, much local authorities who need, after all, to deliver homes and development and renewal, as it's not just the private sector that's got that interest, is working through. And you've just heard, Philip talk about it. What is the best way to deal with this? Where do the issues lie? Understand it and then tackle it. And then what is the contribution that developers would appropriately make to it? But the other element that I wanted to flag is actually innovative thinking. I was for a long time a director at South West Water, and we pioneered what we called upstream thinking, which was, instead of putting expensive plant in and equipment at the end of the pipe to take out the things you didn't want in it, was to actually spend money helping people avoid putting things in it in the first place. There's a lot with RAG, which blocks up the sewers, but actually the best example with upstream thinking is the work that's been done with farmers to get them to farm differently, so that pollution isn't going in to the water in the first place. And in the end, that means that customers' bills have been cheaper, less investment has taken place. And why it was innovative was that for most water companies, of course, getting agreement from Natural England and the water regulator that you need a piece of plant increases your profit. Because once you persuade them that you need something to tackle a problem, you're then allowed the capital to do it, and you're allowed to make a return on that. And South West Water didn't do that. We actually proposed something that was cheaper. And for a long time, Ofwat said it's not our business, it's the Environment Agency. This shouldn't be water companies. This is somebody else's problem. And we had to overcome that. That's not the view at Ofwat anymore, the water regulator, at all. It's rather changed. But we had a real upstream battle with it on upstream thinking. But the reason that South West Water did it was that our bills were too high and unacceptable to customers. So actually, it was in the business's interest to tackle the problem. So all I'm really saying on that is, I rather agree with it. I think one needs to understand what the various sources are, and not just think, will you do some chemical dosing to remove it at the end, need to think imaginatively about how you avoid it getting into the system. And that may well be something that you can make an effective contribution to within the development. It may be that actually there's, as with South West Water, there are contributions to supporting farmers to change what they're doing in ways that actually improve outcomes. And frankly, I think there's going to be an awful lot of effort from government. This is where perhaps the development sector needs to be saying this, is what we put in our washing machine shouldn't be causing this problem in the first place. And we're all responsible for that. So we need to be thinking about all of these elements. But simply to say, this is terrible, totally unrealistic, life should go on as before, forget it. That's not where the mood is.
Excellent, thank you. And I think you know, we're sensing that this is an issue that's going to repeat itself across the UK. We've seen it in Poole Harbour, the Solent, in Kent, in some of the tributaries of the Severn in the West Midlands. It's now in Somerset. We hear Chichester Harbour is next, and you know, it will keep going. And so, you know, there must be a national desire, given Boris's build programme. There must be a national desire to try and resolve a bigger picture solution. But at this point, I just want to bring Richard in, if I may. Richard, from what you've heard today, and from what you know at the sharp end of housing acquisition, housing site acquisition, planning applications and delivery, how is this going to affect Taylor Wimpey's acquisition and development programme?
Well, it has quite a significant impact in the short term. So Nick very helpfully illustrated the type of numbers that even just in his authority, they're dealing with applications which they cannot determine at this point in time. And we've all spoken about how some larger sites, so sites that Taylor Wimpey might be involved with, have the potential to deal with the compensatory measures on site, whether that's through wetland planting and reed beds, or whether or not it's a more sort of engineering-led solution. Larger sites have a greater capacity to deal with it. It's the smaller schemes, anywhere between, you know, really 20 and 200, are going to have a real problem in actually sort of trying to give this mitigation, this compensatory measures. And until there is some sort of strategic off-site solution, they are going to be stalled. Now, what that will probably mean is that if you're looking for an immediate site, or if you want an outlet in the next 12 to 18 months, it's not going to be in those authorities. You're going to have to invest your money where you are able to get your applications determined so you can start development on sites. Now, that's not to say that developers won't want to work with authorities, because lots of us already have commitments and investment in the areas that are impacted. But if you want to, you know, continue building, and if you want your new site in a new location, chances are it's not going to be, say, in an area that drains the levels over the next 12 to 18 months. So it is a real problem. And say the sooner that we get some sort of strategic solution, the better for smaller schemes. And I think from Natural England and developers and local authorities' point of view, we all need to work really closely together to try and find some sort of on-site solutions for the schemes that can deliver on-site solutions.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think the seriousness of the problem, you know, Nick has talked about his authority. We've got schemes, a couple of large schemes in Mendip which are caught at the moment, and actually with a large allocation, everybody's on the hunt for suitable mitigation land. No one quite knows how much they need and of what type of land, so we're very, very early in the process, but I think we've got to get to a point whereby we're working together. But you know, I see from the chat, Nick, that the authorities are writing to the ministry, should go out this week, signed by the chief execs. That's great. I know the HBF have been talking to ministers as well, but I think this is a really key point, that actually ministers must be aware of the significance of the issue, that it requires a a national solution. on a number of fronts, and it's not just for Natural England. In my opinion, with respect to Natural England, is not enough for them to embargo housing developments and from the solutions. They need to be at the heart of everything and working proactively, in my opinion. I think, look, we could go on. We're now an hour and a half in, and I'm probably thinking that we might draw things to a close. Could I just, before we do though on phosphates, could I just have a spin round the panel? Robin, we've not brought you in at this stage, but as a coal-face practitioner, you've heard a lot today. What are your thoughts on the next steps, the way forward, and how we as an industry need to be responding to this?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's working with the local authorities to look at a strategic level fix, but at the sort of micro application level, where you can produce a neutrality document. So a document effectively says, if you do X, Y, and Z, the discharge from the site will be phosphate neutral. Technically, the local authority could approve your appropriate assessment and grant you planning permission as things stand, even without a macro answer. The issue is that when we, as was alluded to, when we put forward, for example, packaged treatment plants that do show neutrality in phosphates, Natural England are just dismissing them and just saying, well, that's not an appropriate solution. So there is that sort of loggerhead, which Natural England in other topics also seem to do, where they just dismiss the mitigation before them, despite the sort of technical solution showing neutrality. So I think that requires maybe a bit of local authorities leaning towards the developer's angle if they've produced such a document, because they're the approving authority, and we have seen in sort of Portsmouth and places authorities granting planning permissions despite what Natural England might say about mitigation measures. So it can be done. It's still a relatively early stage, so we've got to see how it pans out, and hopefully solutions will present themselves sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Robin. And there's a couple of comments on the chat about the farming industry, which I think are pretty pertinent. The authority that Robin was talking about, incidentally, for those who don't know, Portsmouth City Council decided rather ingeniously, if they would call it ingeniously anyway, that if you were to pay them huge financial contributions, they would grant you planning permission, and they would use those contributions to upgrade the flush systems in their social housing portfolio. So they got a free wodge of housing upgrades in return for the grant of planning permission. So well done them for thinking out of the box. I think we're probably going to draw things to a close. So I would just like to say just a couple of things. Firstly, thank you so much to all of our guests out there for joining and listening in and contributing through the chat, and for all of the questions that you submitted through to us at the top. But really, thanks must go to the panel. What a fantastic group of professionals and advisors. Thank you so much for your time today and your insightful contributions. So we hope to see everybody in the flesh at Sandy Park next year for a bacon butty and just to pick up some more hot topics. So it just goes for me to say thank you everybody for joining this year, and it's great to keep in touch with you all, and we look forward to continuing to talk over the coming 12 months. So thank you everybody.